road twisted like a dying thing, coiling deeper into the Appalachian Mountains. My GPS had given up miles ago, leaving me with nothing but the occasional, rusted road sign to guide the way. The further I drove, the fewer signs of life I saw. No houses, no passing cars, just endless trees pressing in from both sides, their bare branches clawing at the overcast sky. I tightened my grip on the wheel. This was exactly what I wanted. Silence, solitude. A break from the chaos of the city, from deadlines, from the constant hum of voices and screens. I told myself the unease in my stomach was just from the isolation. Nothing more. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had started its slow descent, turning the sky into a muted gray-pink haze. The place looked like something pulled from an old horror film. A small, single-story structure with a slanted roof, its wooden walls darkened by time and weather. It stood at the edge of a ridge, overlooking an ocean of trees stretching into the horizon. I stepped out of my car, the cold mountain air biting through my jacket. The silence was unnatural. Not just quiet, but too quiet. No birds, no wind, just my own breathing. A voice made me jump. Shouldn't stay after dark. I turned sharply. An old man stood a few feet away, half hidden in the tree line. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, his eyes sharp beneath the shadow of a worn-out cap. He carried himself stiffly, like someone who had spent years in hard labor. "You must be Roger," I said, forcing a casual tone. He didn't answer right away, just studied me with the kind of look you give a man standing on thin ice. He walked closer, holding up a keyring. I reached for it, but he didn't let go immediately. "You listening to me, boy?" he asked. His grip on the keys tightened. "You leave before sundown, no matter what." I frowned. "Why? Something wrong with the place?" His jaw clenched. "Cabin's fine. It's the land that ain't." That should have been my first clue to turn around. But instead, I just laughed it off, thinking it was the usual small-town superstition. "Appreciate the warning, but I'll be fine," I said. Roger held my gaze a second longer, then let go of the keys and turned away. He walked back into the trees without another word, disappearing into the gloom as if he had never been there at all. I stood there for a moment, unsettled, before shaking it off. Just a weird old man, trying to scare the outsider. Nothing more. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and dust. It was small but comfortable. A single bedroom, a modest kitchen, and a living room with an old stone fireplace. A few pieces of rustic furniture were scattered around, all worn but sturdy. I set my bags down and checked my phone. No signal, not even a flicker of a bar. Typical. I lit the fireplace and settled in, flipping through an old book I found on the shelf. The warmth of the flames and the stillness of the cabin should have been relaxing, but something gnawed at the edge of my mind. Maybe it was Roger's warning. Maybe it was the unnatural silence outside. Or maybe it was the feeling, small at first, but growing, that I was not alone. The cabin smelled of old wood and dust, the kind of scent that lingered in places left untouched for too long. It wasn't filthy, but it had that stale, abandoned feel like no one had lived here in years. The air inside was thick, and the single window in the living room barely let in any light. I set my bag down, stretching my sore shoulders from the long drive. I told myself I needed this. Silence, solitude, a break from everything back home. No deadlines, no emails, no city noise. Just me, the mountains, and this cabin. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not peaceful, too quiet. The kind of quiet that made you aware of your own breathing. No wind, no birds, not even the distant hum of insects. I stepped onto the porch and looked out at the trees. They stood there, tall and still, almost unnatural in their stillness. Shaking the feeling off, I went back inside. The furniture was old but sturdy. A single couch, a wooden table, and a fireplace coated in soot. A small bookshelf stood in the corner, covered in a thick layer of dust. My eyes scanned the shelves, mostly old travel guides and outdated maps. Then, tucked near the edge, I saw it. A journal. It was small, leather-bound, with a cracked spine and yellowed pages. The second I picked it up, a faint shiver crawled up my arms. I don't know why. Maybe it was the way it felt in my hands. Heavy, like something that carried weight beyond just its pages. I took it to the table and flipped through. The handwriting was frantic, uneven, like the person writing it had been in a hurry. The first few pages were just scribbled notes. Then I found something that made me stop. If you're reading this, you need to leave. Don't stay after dark. Don't listen to them. I exhaled, shaking my head. A prank. Some weird joke, left behind by the last guest. But as I kept reading, the entries became more erratic. The whispers started on the first night. Thought it was the wind. It wasn't. Something moves outside after midnight. Stays just beyond the trees. Watching. I lock the doors, but that doesn't matter. They get closer each night. A lump formed in my throat. I didn't believe in ghosts or monsters, but there was something unsettling about reading another person's paranoia. I could almost feel their fear bleeding through the ink. The last entry was dated 5 years ago. If you see the cellar, don't open it. It's the only thing keeping them out. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My first instinct was to laugh, but my throat was too dry. I set the journal down, running a hand through my hair. Just a story, I told myself. Someone had probably left it as a joke. A sudden thump made me jump. It came from the front porch. I froze, my pulse hammering. It could have been a branch falling, maybe an animal. I stood slowly, moving toward the door. Through the small window, I couldn't see anything, just the empty porch and the darkening woods beyond. I reached for the knob, hesitating. Something about opening the door didn't feel right. Instead, I flicked on the porch light. The bulb buzzed to life, casting a dim glow over the wooden planks. Nothing. Just as I started to relax, a shadow moved at the edge of the trees. It was fast, almost too fast for my eyes to follow. My stomach tightened. I pressed my face closer to the glass, squinting into the darkness. Nothing. Just trees. I exhaled sharply and stepped back. My nerves were shot from the long drive. That was all. I needed sleep. Shaking my head, I locked the door, double-checking it just in case. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. The journal was still on the table, left open to the last page. But now, there was something new. Something I was sure hadn't been there before. In the faint glow of the porch light, fresh words had appeared beneath the last entry. You shouldn't have looked. The morning air was cold and damp as I drove into town, my hands gripping the wheel a little too tight. I hadn't slept much. The whispers outside the cabin had kept me awake, gnawing at my nerves. I told myself it was the wind, maybe an animal brushing against the walls, but a deeper part of me wasn't so sure. The town was small, barely more than a main street with a gas station, a diner, and a handful of old shops. The kind of place where everyone knew each other, and immediately knew when someone didn't belong. As I pulled up at the gas station, a few locals outside gave me a quick glance before looking away, like they didn't want to get involved. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and motor oil. A middle-aged man stood behind the counter, flipping through a newspaper. I grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and made my way up to him. "You the one renting that cabin up on Black Hollow Ridge?" he asked without looking up. I hesitated. "Yeah, why?" He finally met my eyes. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in the way he studied me, like he was deciding whether or not to say something. After a moment, he just shook his head and rang me up. "That'll be $3.50, he muttered. I pulled out my wallet. "You know anything about that place? Seems like people around here don't like talking about it." The man exhaled sharply, handing me my change. "Then maybe you ought to stop asking it." Before I could press him further, the bell above the door jingled as someone walked in. I turned to see Roger standing there, his heavy boots leaving faint prints on the dusty floor. His sharp blue eyes locked onto mine immediately. "Come outside," he said, his voice low and firm. I followed him without a word. Outside, the morning sun did little to warm the air. Roger led me to the side of the building, away from prying ears. His face was lined with years of hard living, his expression the same unreadable mask as the gas station clerk's. But there was something else in his eyes, something heavier. "You shouldn't be here," he said. I crossed my arms. "Yeah, I've been hearing that a lot. Care to explain why?" Roger's jaw tightened. He looked past me, toward the tree-covered hills stretching beyond the town. "That land ain't right," he muttered. "People go up there, and some of them don't come back. The ones that do, they don't come back the same." A chill crept down my spine. "Disappear? Like what? Accidents?" Roger shook his head. "Ain't no accidents. Ain't no bears. No hikers getting lost. Something else takes them, and it don't let go." I wanted to laugh, tell him I didn't believe in ghost stories, but the way he said it, so plain, so certain, made my throat dry. I forced a chuckle. Look, I get it. The town has its legends. But Roger stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. It's not a legend, son. You heard him, didn't you? The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I swallowed hard. Heard what? Roger scoffed, shaking his head like he already knew the answer. The voices. The footsteps. Maybe you seen something moving in the trees, thinking it was just a shadow. I stared at him. My heart pounded. I don't know what I heard. I admitted. Probably the wind. Roger's eyes darkened. That's what they want you to think. I let out a shaky breath, trying to keep my voice steady. Then tell me what's really going on. Roger didn't answer right away. He ran a rough hand through his gray beard, like he was debating something. Finally, he spoke. People like you. They always come up here thinking they'll be fine, thinking they know better. And every damn time, it ends the same. Either you leave now, or you stay long enough to wish you had. A sharp gust of wind rustled the trees behind us. Roger glanced toward the mountains. His fingers twitched at his side, as if he wanted to reach for something that wasn't there. If you stay another night, lock the doors, shut the curtains, and for God's sake, whatever you do, don't look outside. My mouth went dry. Why not? His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw fear in them. Because if you see them, he said softly, they'll know you're theirs. I swallowed hard. The morning sun suddenly felt colder. Roger stepped back. This is your last warning, kid. Go back to the city. Forget this place. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the parking lot, my heart hammering against my ribs. I wanted to ignore him. I wanted to believe he was just an old man spouting backwoods superstitions. But deep down, I knew he was telling the truth. I woke up to the sound of something scratching. At first, I thought it was a branch against a cabin wall, scraping in the wind. But as I sat up in bed, listening, I realized it was coming from inside. A slow, deliberate drag of something sharp against wood. I reached for my phone, but the screen was black dead. My charger was still plugged into the wall, but the battery had drained overnight. I took a breath, steadying my nerves, and stepped onto the creaking floor. The scratching had stopped. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. Then I saw it. A large, dark stain had spread across the wooden floor near the fireplace. It hadn't been there last night. The wood looked wet, but when I crouched down and touched it, my fingers came away dry. The color was wrong. Too dark for water, too faded for fresh blood. That's when I noticed the corner of the rug was curled up, as if someone had been dragging it. I hesitated before pulling it back. Underneath was a trapdoor. A thick, heavy panel of wood set into the floor, sealed shut with rusted chains. The padlock was old, almost ancient, its metal corroded with time. I pressed my hand against the wood and felt a faint vibration beneath my palm. A hum, almost like something was moving underneath. The scratching sound returned. Not from outside, not from the walls, from beneath the trapdoor. A chill crawled up my spine. I backed away, my breath coming fast. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and pointed it at the floor, but there were no gaps, no spaces between the boards. Whatever was underneath, it was locked in tight. I swallowed hard and turned back to the table where I had left the journal. Flipping through the pages, I searched for anything, any mention of cellar. The writing was erratic, scrawled in uneven, jagged letters. Then I found it, a passage near the back. If the door is locked, do not open it. It keeps them out. It keeps them in. I looked back at the trapdoor. The air seemed thicker now, pressing against my skin like humidity before a storm. My ears rang with a strange, distant hum, as if the room itself was vibrating. And then, softly, faintly, I heard it. A whisper. Not words. Not quite a voice. Just a breath, slow and ragged, rising from beneath the floor. I bolted. I grabbed my jacket, shoved my feet into my boots, and threw open the cabin door. The cold mountain air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop moving. I needed answers. I needed Roger. Because whatever was under that trapdoor, it wasn't supposed to be there. And I had a horrible feeling it knew I had found it. I didn't want to go into the woods. But the journal had mentioned a campsite, and I needed answers. Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, to lock the doors and wait for morning. But how could I sleep when something had scratched the walls of my cabin last night? When my belongings had been moved, and the air outside carried whispers that had no source. So I grabbed my flashlight, a pocket knife, useless, but it made me feel better, and my phone, though there was no signal this deep in the mountains. Then I stepped off the cabin porch and into the trees. The forest was thick, swallowing the fading daylight. The ground was damp, covered in decaying leaves, and the air smelled like rain that had never quite dried. Every sound felt sharper, the crunch of my boots, the distant rustling of unseen creatures. And somewhere, barely audible, the wind carried a sound like breathing. I followed the directions from the journal. Due east from the cabin. 600 steps. My heart pounded as I counted in my head. The deeper I went, the darker it got. The trees seemed to press closer together, their twisted branches reaching like fingers. Then I saw it. The campsite. It was old, forgotten. 3 rotting tents stood in a small clearing, their fabric torn and sagging. A rusted fire pit sat in the center, surrounded by scattered belongings, backpacks, a broken lantern, a shoe. My flashlight beam flickered over them, and a strange chill crawled up my spine. Someone had been here, but they had never left. I stepped forward carefully, scanning the area. Inside one of the tents, I found a sleeping bag, still zipped up but covered in mold. A notebook lay half buried in the dirt nearby, its pages waterlogged and unreadable. Then my foot hit something solid. A camera. I crouched and picked it up. It was coated in mud, its lens cracked, but the battery compartment was intact. I didn't know if it would turn on, but I shoved it into my jacket pocket. Maybe it held answers. A gust of wind rushed through the clearing, and suddenly, the woods felt wrong. Heavy, like I wasn't alone. I turned slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The trees stood silent, but my skin prickled with the feeling of being watched. And then I saw it. A single footprint. Fresh. Not mine. I froze. My breath hitched. The print was deep, leading away from the campsite, into the trees. My light followed its path, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement. A shadow shifting between the trunks. A whisper drifted through the air, so close it could have been right beside me. Go back. My blood turned to ice. I ran. I didn't look back. Branches whipped at my face as I sprinted through the dark, my legs burning. The cabin. I had to get back to the cabin. The whisper followed me, growing louder, no longer one voice but many. By the time I reached my porch, I could barely breathe. My hands fumbled with the door handle, and I threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. Silence. The whispering had stopped, but when I turned, my stomach dropped. My front door, the same one I had just locked, was wide open. I couldn't get the image of that last camera clip out of my mind. The man's face twisted in terror, begging someone, anyone, not to open the cellar. And then the last frame, when someone loomed behind him in the shadows. I had to know what was down there. I didn't believe in ghosts. I didn't believe in curses. But there was something pulling me closer to that locked door beneath the rug. Something that whispered in the back of my mind, telling me to look, to open it. Maybe it was foolish, but I couldn't stop myself. The chain was rusted, thick, and stubborn as hell. I tugged at it with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. A crow cawed outside, its call long and hollow, like it was echoing in my bones. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. The air in the cabin felt heavier, like the walls themselves were watching me. I found an old crowbar near the woodpile outside. It was rusted, too, but it had the weight I needed. I wedged it under the chain, gritting my teeth, the metal screeching as it scraped the stone. After a few tries, the lock gave way with a sharp snap, the chains falling away like dead weight. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I stood there, staring down at the door. My heart hammered against my ribs. Something was wrong. But what if I was just being paranoid? What if there was nothing but dust and forgotten junk in there? I reached for the handle, my hand trembling. It turned with a groan, and the door creaked open. The air down there was stale, thick with the smell of rot. But there was something else, something older, earthier. It smelled like time had stopped, like something had been waiting, unmoving, for years. The darkness in that hole felt deeper than the cabin itself, like it swallowed everything around it. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and shone it down into the basement. The beam sliced through the blackness, illuminating stone steps that descended into nothing. The air felt colder, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I stepped down. Each creak of the floorboards echoed like a shout in the silence. My breath came too quickly, and I had to stop myself from running back upstairs. But I had come too far. There was no going back now. At the bottom of the stairs, I almost dropped the flashlight. There were bones, small piles of them. Some looked human, some not. There were ribs and skulls, fingers clinging to old, tattered clothes, and what looked like the remains of animals I couldn't even name. The scent of decay grew stronger as I stepped deeper into the room. I kept shining the beam across the floor, my pulse racing, trying to make sense of it all. The walls were covered in old symbols, scratches, etchings, things I didn't want to understand. They seemed to twist and curl like vines, like they were alive, pulsing with something dark. And then I saw it, a pile of old photographs, half buried in the corner, dirt smudging their corners. My hand shook as I picked them up, the edges curling in my grip. The first photo was of a family, smiling, standing in front of the cabin, all fresh-faced and bright-eyed. The next one, though, was different. The family looked confused, and there was fear in their eyes. The background was darker. The trees outside seemed to stretch too far. The third photo made my stomach churn. It was a close-up of a man's face, taken from the corner of the room. His eyes were wide, his mouth open in a scream. There was something wrong with his skin. It looked pulled tight, stretched, like it didn't belong on his face. And behind him, a shape, just barely visible in the shadows, like a tall figure with no distinct features, its head too large for its body. The last photo was the one that hit me like a punch in the gut. It was me, taken through the window, exactly like the others. My own face, staring at the camera, looking out into the woods. I hadn't been standing there. I hadn't heard anyone outside. The shutter had clicked, capturing my fear before I even knew it was coming. I stumbled back, the flashlight clattering to the ground. My heart thudded in my chest as my mind raced. Someone had been here. Someone had watched me. But it couldn't have been Roger, could it? No, he wouldn't do this. But what if he knew? What if he wanted me to find this? I picked up the flashlight, my hands clammy, and pointed it toward the far wall. There, scratched deep into the stone, was another symbol, a circle with lines radiating out, like a wheel with no spokes. It was fresh. I stared at it, trying to piece together what it meant. What was the connection between all of this? What was this ritual, and why was I here? I felt a sudden pressure on my chest, like something was pushing down on me. I turned around, and for a split second, I thought I saw something moving in the corner of the room. Someone, tall and thin, their outline blending with the shadows. I blinked, and it was gone. A chill swept through me. I wasn't alone. Something was watching me. I needed to leave. But the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. The flashlight flickered once, and then died. The darkness closed in. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, pressing against my lungs like someone was holding me down. I had barely shut the cellar door behind me when I heard it again. That whisper. This time it wasn't from the walls. It wasn't in the woods. It was inside my head. Mike. The voice wasn't mine, but it was calling me, and that made it worse. The hairs on my neck stood up as I turned, eyes scanning the room, but the shadows seemed to stretch too far, too fast. I tried to shake it off. The forest was just playing tricks on me, right? It wasn't real. None of it was real. I had to leave. My legs were already moving before my mind caught up, but just as I reached the door, it slammed shut in front of me. No, not just slammed. Banged. Hard. It shook the entire cabin. For a second, I thought it would cave in. My heart pounded in my chest. I spun around, my breath coming in quick gasps. And that's when I heard it. Outside, the low hum of voices. So faint I almost thought it was the wind. No, this wasn't the wind. I went to the window. I had to see what it was. I had to know if I was going crazy. When I pulled back the curtain, I saw them. I didn't know what they were at first. Tall shadows. Too tall. Too thin. They weren't human. Not in any way that made sense. They just stood there, perfectly still on the edge of the tree line. I could barely make out their shapes in the moonlight, but I could see enough. Those long, unnatural limbs stretching out too far, too wrong, like something out of nightmare. I stepped back, heart hammering. I knew I should have closed the curtain, locked the door, and just left. But I couldn't. I felt drawn to them, like they were pulling me closer, whether I liked it or not. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. My name, over and over. Mike. Mike! Mike! I stumbled away from the window and collapsed onto the couch, my legs too weak to hold me up. I tried to swallow, but my mouth was dry. I could still hear them, those voices circling around me. They weren't outside anymore. They were inside, crawling through the walls, through the floors, through my thoughts. A knock at the door. Not a polite one, not a human knock, more like a force. A slam against the wood that rattled the hinges. I froze. The door swung open, and there he was. Roger. He didn't look like the same man anymore. His face was pale, eyes wide with fear, his hands shaking as he held the shotgun. He didn't speak right away. His eyes flicked to the shadows outside, and I followed his gaze, only to see that the figures were no longer standing still. They were moving, slowly, closer, one long step after another, like they had all the time in the world. "You need to get out of here." Roger finally spoke, his voice hoarse. He stepped inside, slamming the door shut behind him. "Now, I can't. They're outside." "There," my voice faltered. "They're not just outside." Roger cut me off. He moved to the window, peering out, then quickly pulled the blinds down. "They're coming. And it's because of you. You opened the door." I felt dizzy. I didn't understand. I didn't open anything. Did I? Had I? Roger looked at me, his face hardening. "You've done something worse than you know, Mike. Those things out there, they're not just wandering around. They're waiting for something." I swallowed, panic clawing at my chest. Waiting for what? He hesitated. Then, his voice lowered to a near whisper. They're waiting for you to finish what was started." I was going to ask him what the hell he meant, but before I could, the walls shook again. This time, the whole cabin trembled. A low rumbling sound came from deep in the earth, and the wood of the floor beneath us groaned like it was about to crack. Roger turned to face me, his face grim. "You were meant to come here. They've been calling you, haven't they? You hear them now, don't you?" I nodded, unable to speak. The whispers were louder now, so loud they almost drowned out everything else. "They're not going to stop, Mike," Roger continued, his voice tight. "Not unless you give them what they want." "What do they want?" I was shaking, my knees buckling beneath me. "What do they want from me?" Roger's eyes flicked toward the door, then back to me. He stepped closer, lowering his voice even more. "You were never meant to survive this. None of us are. But if you're lucky, if you know what's good for you, you'll leave now and never come back." I stared at him. Roger was no longer just a grumpy, cryptic old man. He was terrified, too, and I could see it in his eyes. Whatever those things were, he knew they were real. And worse, he knew they were going to get me, just like they got everyone else. But I couldn't leave. I couldn't just run. I had to know what they were, what they wanted, why they were here. But before I could ask Roger anything else, the ground beneath us shook harder. And then I heard it. A scream. Not human. It was coming from outside. Roger's face twisted in terror as he grabbed my arm. "Get to the cellar now." He shoved me toward the trapdoor. "No," I protested, shaking my head. "What's happening?" "Were they?" "They're here," Roger muttered under his breath, his voice trembling. "And you're not going to like what comes next." He grabbed me by the wrist and forced me into the cellar, locking the door behind us just as the first of the watchers stepped into the cabin. I heard the sound of nails scratching at the door. Something low and terrible, something hungry. And I knew, in that moment, I was never going to leave this place alive. The air inside the cabin had thickened. Every breath felt like a drag, like I was inhaling the weight of something ancient and oppressive. The walls trembled, a low, unnatural hum vibrating through the floorboards, and the shadows in the corners seemed to move, undulating like living things. The whispers had turned into something more, a guttural growl, a low warning that made my stomach churn. The creatures were close. I could feel them outside, could hear them circling, tapping at the windows like they knew exactly where I was. Roger stood in front of me, his face pale, eyes wide with fear, the shotgun clutched tight in his hands. He didn't need to say it. I could see the desperation in his eyes. The creatures were coming, and there was only one way out. But it was a choice I wasn't prepared for, a choice I didn't want to make. "You're too late," Roger rasped, his voice hoarse and ragged. "The ritual, it has to be done, or we're both dead." I felt the weight of his words. I wasn't ready to believe in any of this. A part of me wanted to scream at him, call him crazy, demand he tell me this was all a joke, that I could walk out of here and be free. But the look in his eyes told me there was no joke. The horror in his gaze was all too real. The floor creaked beneath us as the house groaned, a sharp crack splitting the air like a warning. The watchers were here. I could feel them, pressing in on the cabin, surrounding us like a tightening noose. It wasn't just the shadows anymore. I could hear something moving outside. Heavy, deliberate steps, too slow to be human, but not quite like any animal I had ever heard. Something ancient. Roger turned to me then, his hand trembling as he pointed to the journal I had found, still lying open on the table. The pages were smeared with dirt, blood, and something else I couldn't place, as though it had been written in desperation, in the final hours of a mind breaking under the weight of knowledge too terrible to comprehend. He grabbed it, shoving it toward me. "You have to do it," he said. His voice cracked, and for the first time, I saw a real fear in him, something beyond the walls and the warning. "The ritual will keep them in the woods, but it needs a sacrifice, Mike. A living soul. You have to give them something. It's the only way." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. My body was frozen, paralyzed with disbelief. Sacrifice. A living soul. What was he asking me to do? To kill? To give up another person's life, so I could live? I looked at him. He didn't look like a madman. Not now. He was a man desperate for survival. A man who knew too much too late. "What happens if I refuse?" I asked, the words trembling out of my mouth. Roger stepped back, his face draining of color. His eyes flickered to the window, to the dark figures gathering outside. Their shapes were more solid now, their outlines clearer. I could see the shadows stretching unnaturally, like they didn't belong to anything. They were towering, grotesque, with limbs that bent in all the wrong directions. They weren't human. They were something older, something that had been hiding in the corners of this world for too long. "They'll take us," Roger said, his voice barely a whisper, "and we'll never be found. The land claims everything, everyone who stays. It doesn't matter if you believe it or not. The ritual, it keeps them contained. It keeps the door shut. If you don't do it, they'll claim us both. And it won't just be us. It will spread. It'll spread." The weight of his words hit me like a hammer. The creatures outside weren't just hunting for us. They were hunting for everything. The forest, the mountains, the town. This was bigger than just one cabin. It was a warning. I felt the pressure in my chest tighten, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. The door, the cellar. I'd unlocked it. I'd opened it. And now the watchers were here, and they wouldn't leave until they had what they wanted. They wouldn't leave until I made a choice. I turned toward Roger, the question burning in my throat. "Who do I have to sacrifice?" He shook his head, his gaze pleading. "I can't tell you that. I can't. You'll know. You'll know when the time comes. But it has to be one of us. There's no other way." I looked back at the door, hearing the whispering voices growing louder, closer, pressing against the wood like they were waiting for me to make a decision. I felt their cold breath through the cracks. The forest was alive with their hunger. There were 3 of us in this cabin. 3 souls. But only one would walk out. I could feel the choice in my bones now. I could feel it crawling up my spine. That same feeling I'd had when I first stepped onto this cursed land. Something that had always been waiting. Something I was always meant to do. And then, the knock came. Soft at first. A tap on the door. And then it grew louder, more urgent. I closed my eyes. The journal was still in my hands, its pages stained with blood and tears. And the watchers, waiting. Always waiting. My mind screamed to run, to refuse this nightmare. But my heart knew the truth. This was my fate. This was the choice that had been written in the bones of the mountain long before I ever stepped into this place. I looked at Roger one last time. His eyes were pleading. And in that moment, I knew what had to be done. But was I strong enough to make it? Was I capable of making the sacrifice that would allow me to live and damn someone else in the process? The question haunted me as the door shuttered, the creatures pushing against it, waiting for the choice to be made. And that was when I realized the choice wasn't mine to make at all. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, staring at Roger. His face was no longer the weathered mask of a man who had lived through decades of solitude. It was the face of someone who knew he had failed. The shotgun trembled in his hands. The shadows outside the cabin pressed against the windows, blocking out the light. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the land itself had drawn a breath and was holding it in, waiting. The whispers were louder now. They weren't just voices anymore. They were him, the watchers. I could hear their breath, feel their cold, grasping fingers against my skin, even though they weren't there. Yet, Mike, Roger's voice cracked, and he stepped forward. I flinched, but I didn't step back. Listen to me. You have to do it. It's the only way to stop them. If you don't, we're both dead. I glanced at the cellar door, now wide open, the stench of death coming from the darkened pit below. My mind swirled with 1,000 thoughts, but none of them made any sense. I wanted to scream, to run, to hide somewhere, anywhere, but I knew it was too late for that. They'll come for you if you don't act. Roger's words hit me like a slap. His eyes were wide now, almost pleading. His voice, once steady, was shaking. I didn't want this for you. Hell, I didn't want it for me. But the land doesn't care what you want. It doesn't care if you're innocent or not. It takes. I looked past Roger, at the shadowy figures that stood outside the cabin. They were tall, taller than any human should be. The limbs stretched unnaturally long, and their heads tilted to unnatural angles. Eyes, or where their eyes should have been, there were only holes. Dark, empty spaces, sucking in the night. There was no escape. Roger's words grew quieter as I turned back to him. You'll be one of them. If you don't sacrifice, you'll be part of the Watchers, too. You'll be just like me, cursed to guard this land. A prisoner of the forest. I felt my stomach twist. The air around me was closing in. I couldn't breathe. My fingers trembled at my sides, my mind spinning as I stared at Roger. His face was older now, more broken than I'd ever seen it, and I could feel the weight of his life, of all his years of warning, of failing, of knowing the end had come for him. But he wasn't the only one. The land had already claimed him, and now it was reaching for me, pulling me in with an invisible thread, binding me with something darker than fear. I looked at the cellar door again, and for a brief, horrible second, I thought about throwing myself into it. If I did that, maybe I'd end it before it took me, before the Watchers took me. But I couldn't, because in the depths of that dark pit, I saw the truth. There was no running, no escape. Not now. I had to choose. I turned back to Roger, my voice barely a whisper. What happens to me if I don't sacrifice? His eyes filled with something like pity, like he already knew the answer. They'll take you. You'll disappear, like the others. No one will remember you. And after that, you'll be one of them. You'll be hunting the next fool who steps into this place, making them do what you couldn't. It's the only way they let you go. It's the only way to survive. I could see the agony in his face. He had made this choice long ago, and now it was my turn. The Watchers were already closing in. I could hear their whispers again, louder now, echoing in my skull. They wanted me. They wanted my soul, my life. I thought of the journal, of the faces in the photographs. All of them had been just like me, curious, defiant, thinking they could beat the land, outsmart the darkness that lived here. They were wrong. I had been wrong, but there was a chance. I looked down at Roger. His hand was shaking as he held the rifle, the barrel pointing towards the floor now. He was offering me the choice to end it, to end this nightmare. You have to do it, he said again, softer now. It's the only way. Please. I took a deep breath. It felt like I was holding my very last breath. I'm sorry, I whispered, and before I could think about it any longer, I raised the rifle. Roger's eyes were still full of that strange, sad understanding as I pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed in the cabin, shaking the walls, shattering the stillness of the night. Roger's body crumpled, his face frozen in that look of resignation. But as his life drained away, the Watchers outside didn't move. They didn't disappear. I stood over him, my hand still clutching the rifle. For a moment, everything was still. Then, something snapped inside me. I felt in my bones. I had done what needed to be done. The ritual, the sacrifice, it was complete. The Watchers had what they wanted, but I was not free. I looked down at Roger's lifeless body and realized, in that instant, I had become a part of it all. This land, this cursed place, it had taken me to. The ritual wasn't just for survival. It was for becoming part of the forest, becoming part of the Watchers. I was no longer just Mike. I was one of them. The cabin door opened by itself. The forest, dark and silent, called me. I stepped outside, the air colder than it had ever been before. And in the distance, I could see them. The watchers were waiting. And now, I would join them.